So thank you for the invitation to present at this distinguished occasion. Very happy to be here. Online participants, there is a handout for you in the folder as well as a full copy of the paper. It's much too long to read, so I'm going to do my best to summarize and to keep the presentation relatively short to allow a little bit more time for discussion. The title of the paper refers to an article written in 2018 by Jean-Baptiste Gourinat. That should be a hyphenated first name there. This article is framed as a critique of my book, Stoicism and Emotion. Gourinat objects to the way that I reconstruct the process of practical reasoning that gives rise to emotion in early Stoicism, which I, maybe unwisely, dubbed the Pathetic Syllogism, simply picking up on the Greek word for emotion, pathos. In this paper, I seek to defend my reconstruction and to clarify where I stand on the points challenged by Gourinat. I also offer my own challenge to a claim that Gourinat makes about the role of freshness in the mainstream Stoic account. Now, I'm quite happy that Jean-Baptiste wrote this article. He's engaged seriously with my book and given me an opportunity to respond. Although the tone of his piece is combative, its spirit is friendly and constructive. And in fact, he and I are in agreement about the general outlines of the early Stoic account of emotional response. We both see it as a well-worked-out intellectualist analysis that assigned the causation of emotion entirely to carefully specified forms of belief, while not neglecting concomitant physiological events. We share the aim of getting the best reconstruction possible, one that does justice to the mostly fragmentary evidence from ancient Greece and Rome, while also making sense philosophically. I'm going to start the presentation today with a quick overview for the purposes of orientation, not meant to be controversial, of how the Stoic account works. I've given you on the handout not the evidence itself on which the reconstruction is based, but just a few key definitions. In the longer paper, I do provide some pointers to the ancient evidence, so you have that easily to hand if you want it. So, when we speak of the mind in early Stoicism, we're referring to what they called the psyche, a material thing that operates at a number of levels to impart to a person all the properties that they have, all their life functions, but in particular, that serves as the central directive faculty of the human being that processes received or remembered information and generates our responses. A human being is a rational animal in that we're the kind of animal whose directive faculty does that processing in a certain characteristic way. Our awareness of the world takes the form of rational impressions, ones that have propositional content. And we have, in addition, the capacity of assent, by which we assess those propositions for fit with beliefs that we have already formed, and so form new beliefs, which are sometimes expressed in action. The term assent refers to that assessment of fit when we accept some impression as true or reject it as false. It's our capacity for assent that distinguishes us as rational beings. We're rational in at least that minimal descriptive sense, even though we're often not rational in the stronger sense of making correct and properly justified judgments. Now, the central claim of Stoic philosophy of mind is that action is generated on the basis of assent. All our actions, properly so called, are governed by and directly attributable to the mind's directive faculty. To take a standard example, the action of walking does not consist in movements of the feet, but in the mental event that initiates such movements, called an impulse. The Greek word horme literally means an act initiation. An impulse is a species of assent. It occurs when one assents to an impression that takes the form it's appropriate or suitable or fitting. It fits with my existing views about myself and my situation that I should move my feet right now. The foot movements are just what happens when you walk. They are, as it were, the effect of walking, whereas walking itself is the assent. That is why walking counts as a voluntary action and one that the person herself is responsible for. That same framework is then applied to the emotions. They are, in fact, a species of voluntary action. Every instance of emotion, when someone becomes angry or afraid or whatever, is by definition an impulse. Accordingly, it consists in assent to an impression that takes the form, it's fitting right now for me to do the anger thing or the fear thing. The difference from non-emotive action is that here, the predicate, doing the anger thing, is designated by one of a series of terms that seem to refer to some alteration in the mind material itself, its shape or position. Words like to reach out or to withdraw or to contract or to lower. Those would be alterations that the mind itself can feel via proprioception. Hence we have feelings. Further, the impulses that count as emotions are said to be excessive impulses, ones that tend to override any contravening impulse in the same way that an impulse to run downhill might override a subsequent impulse to stop running downhill. Then further, we're told that the cause of the emotional impulse is always a belief that includes a value term. Delight, for example, is caused by a belief that a good thing is present. Desire is caused by a belief that a good thing is in prospect, fear by a belief that a bad thing is in prospect. Here, good thing and bad thing are understood in a strong sense, not just as something minimally advantageous or disadvantageous, for which the Stoics had other terms, but as something that is essential to the agent's overall well-being or destructive of it. So they're what Terry Irwin has termed uncompromising evaluations. And since we are now supposed to be doing ethics and not just philosophy of mind, I should add that for the ancient Stoics, these are also mistakes of valuing. In all ordinary cases of emotion, anger, desire, fear, grief, the objects with which we're concerned are not really goods or evils. They're not instances or activities of virtue or vice, but only external circumstances, acquisitions of money, slights to one's reputation, deaths of one's relatives, and the like. We note that on this account, the emotion does not consist in a sensed psychophysical alteration as such. Rather, it consists in the impulse to undergo such an alteration, to elevate or contract or extend one's soul material. It is indeed an action for which one can be held responsible, even though we sometimes feel helpless to stop it. A mental sensation that didn't come about through assent would be involuntary. And there are such sensations. You could think of the startle reflex, for instance. But by the same token, that involuntary reaction would not count as an emotion. Now, in all of that, I believe that Gourinat and I are largely in agreement. Where we come apart is in the effort to provide a more substantive reconstruction by spelling out how exactly beliefs about value figure into the mental event that is an occurrent emotion. Specifically, the issue is at what point a person decides that the thing the emotion about is good or bad. Does that evaluation occur in the very moment the emotion occurs? Or is it already resident in the person's mind, only waiting for the occasion to come to light? So suppose, for example, that I become excited, exultant when I see a certain baseball land in a certain glove of a certain center fielder. And I have this, excited feeling. What happened in me? Does that happen because I realize right now not only that my team has just won, but also that victory for my team is a really good thing? Or did I hold the latter belief all along so that the sight of the ball in the glove merely activates what was already there in me? Those two accounts are substantively different. In Stoicism and Emotion, I opted for what I felt was a minimal approach. I pointed out that when our sources say something like, the cause of fear is believing that an evil is in prospect, which it's appropriate to avoid, the content that is posited for the stimulus is not that something in prospect is an evil, but rather that an evil thing is in prospect. In other words, something the agent already regards as bad is seen to be impending. Agamemnon holds a dispositional belief that the defeat of his army is a terrible thing, so when he looks out from his camp and sees the Trojan watchfires right outside the embankment, all he needs is a simple type token inference. Defeat from my army is in general bad. An instance of defeat is at hand in this moment. Since he also naturally believes that he should do the fear thing whenever an evil is impending, he immediately generates feelings of fear. Spelling that out, I modeled the practical reasoning that takes place in emotion as a set of premises that fit together into the complex impression we find in the ancient record. That is the model that I called the Pathetic Syllogism. At minimum, and you can now follow this on your handout, the chain of reasoning includes two premises that are dispositional beliefs and just one that is an occurrent belief. As you see, premise one, objects of a certain kind are goods or maybe evils. Premise two, if a good or an evil is present to me or about to be, then it's appropriate for me to okay, and here I put M, to do the emotion thing. That is to have certain feelings. Then the occurrent premise, 3, an object of the kind identified in P1 is present to me or in prospect right now. Putting those together, I yield the conclusion, it is appropriate for me right now to have that emotion. Only premise 3 is formed in the very moment the emotion occurs, and we note that premise 3 is relatively trivial, just a simple observation that one makes about one's current situation. What really drives the conclusion is the two dispositional components, P1 and P2, and in particular, P1. The dispositional evaluative belief that some object type, something like winning a game or losing an army, having your reputation damaged, something like that, is seriously good or seriously bad thing to have happen. When we believe that, we are set up for emotional reactions whenever things of that kind occur. And that is exactly what Gourinat finds distasteful about my interpretation. In his view, it's just not plausible to say that the early Stoic theory made every instance of emotion dependent on a type level belief about some object being good or bad. So he writes, as a general assessment, it may seem very doubtful that, according to the Stoics, every emotion involves a general opinion about what is good. It seems more plausible to me that many cases of Stoic emotions involve a particular opinion about what is good for an individual, which may not be subsumed under a general opinion. If this is the case, then the mechanism of Stoic emotion does not involve a pathetic syllogism in conformity with the model proposed by Graver. He concedes that something like that might be operative in some experiences of emotion, but he doesn't think that it's what always happens. And if it's not always, then the model is wrong. Accordingly, he rejects the model involving P1, the dispositional evaluative belief, and proposes instead a simpler model in which the ascription of value that typically occurs in the very moment one has the emotion. That is just the model I was trying to get away from. To me, it's inherently implausible. But Gourinat's intuition goes the other way. So why is that? To some extent, he seems to be motivated by considerations of economy. He wants to avoid saddling the Stoics with more and bigger mental commitments than is absolutely necessary. And as a rule, I am sympathetic to that kind of consideration. It seems to me, though, that he may not have realized just how minimal my suggestion was meant to be, and why I think that it is necessary. Using another standard example, I can remind him that just as one needs to have a concept of what a horse is in order to recognize that this animal is a horse, so also one could never judge some specific object to be a good if one didn't have an applicable concept of goodness to refer to. I'd hardly think of today's lottery win as a good if I didn't have a concept of good that encompasses sudden acquisitions of money. And having such a concept is not functionally different from having a long-term belief that instances of money getting are good for me as a rule. There is ample evidence that Stoics of all periods in the Greco-Roman world were strongly interested in addressing such mistaken notions of value, regarding them as chief causes of immoral behavior and equally of emotional distress. The entire premise of a Stoic therapy for the emotions was that correcting a person's dispositional beliefs would change their pattern of emotional response, which would not be possible if the mistaken evaluations were typically formed in the very moment the emotion occurs. I should have been clearer, though, about what it means to hold a general evaluative belief. Gourinat remarks, a little facetiously, I think, that one can enjoy a glass of wine without thinking that all wines are good. He's French. More seriously, he points to a passage in the handbook of Epictetus. So this is T2, where Epictetus notes that people can be untroubled by the deaths of strangers and yet grieve heavily for members of their own family. Obviously, these people do not think that all deaths are bad. I had assumed, though, that when we say that someone evaluates objects of a certain type as good or as bad, we mean good or bad relative to that person. Good means good for me, part of my flourishing life. I don't have to believe that drinking fine wine is good for everyone in the world in order to take pleasure in this glass that's in front of me. But I do have to believe that partaking of such things is valuable and important for me. And similarly, what causes us pain when family members die is not the view that all death is bad. It's the tremendous value that we assign to our own dear people. And that too, even though they're specific people, that too is a general evaluation. We believe that having those people in our life is good and losing them is bad, not just when those things happen on those specific occasions, but as a general matter, for whenever such events might occur. Even with a single individual, one might hold a dispositional evaluative belief that all events of the type, that person is lost to me, are bad. All events of that type. I knew for a long time that if anything were to happen to my mother, it would be a terrible loss for me. And when she did pass, I did experience it that way, but not because of a new evaluation. In the last section of his paper, so I'm now skipping a whole lot, you'll forgive me. So in the last section of his paper and also of mine, I'm now on page 17, Gourinat appeals to two stories from Greek literature that he feels support his approach rather than mine. The first is the jilted Medea. In the moment when she opts to take revenge on Jason by killing the children that they have together. Medea realizes that the death of her children is bad for herself, but she says, anger is more powerful than my counsels. She thus serves as a classic example of acrasia or weakness of will. The other example is that of Menelaus after the fall of Troy, and the moment when he encounters Helen, his former wife. Again, it's a case of acrasia. Menelaus decides to kill Helen, no doubt for reasons of policy, but then her dress falls open to reveal her breast, and he stays his hand. In Gourinat's reading, neither of those cases is compatible with an analysis that relates the emotive judgment to a dispositional belief about the value of its object. Medea does not believe in general that it's good for her to take revenge for an offense. And Menelaus does not believe in general that Helen should be preserved. Instead, he says, their impulses need to be explained in terms of spur-of-the-moment decisions that have nothing to do with their prior beliefs. Now, both Medea and Menelaus were treated as case studies in the most influential of all the Stoic treatises on emotion, the one by Chrysippus of Soli. For Chrysippus, these two figures are illustrations of the way emotions can make us act against our better judgment. When I treated them in Stoicism and Emotion, I connected them to the runner and the downhill running analogy that Chrysippus uses to explain the excessiveness or overriding power of the emotional impulse. As with the runner who tries to stop, there are, in each case, two impulses issued by the directive faculty, one of which overpowers the other. Chrysippus's point is that while there is mental conflict there, it's not a conflict between a rational judgment and some kind of unreasoning force, but rather a conflict between two decisions, each of which is made for its own reasons. Medea's anger is a judgment that she should proceed with her revenge, a judgment that she makes because that is what she sees as valuable. So powerful is her commitment to this idea that it overrides her competing judgment that the death of her children will be bad. In the case of Menelaus, the emotion impulse comes second. Whatever reasons he had for striking Helen down go out the window when he sees her breast, and his mind endorses a competing impression that has overriding force to the effect that Helen's beauty is what he should reach out for above all else. Both anecdotes, then, are open to an explanation that traces the emotion back to a dispositional evaluative belief. Medea is acting upon her personal conviction that loss of status is bad for her and getting revenge is good. Menelaus is motivated by a simpler commitment to touching and fondling his wife whenever the opportunity presents itself. Although Chrysippus's full discussion of these two case studies does not survive, full disclosure, I believe that this is the style of explanation that he would prefer. Gourinat, however, is not satisfied with an explanation of these characters' behavior that appeals to their prior beliefs. Instead, he devotes his attention to a different feature of emotion, the element of emotive judgments that appears in the definitions, the ancient definitions, and is called freshness, the prosphaton. So he writes, and I gave you this, what this means seems quite clear. The impression is vivid and strikes the agent more than the beliefs they have previously entertained. And this is the reason why the fresh belief eclipses a previous decision. The cause of Menelaus's emotion is the freshness of an impression that overwhelms his reasonable convictions and his former resolutions. Of course, sometimes the cause of an emotion is the education that is given as a conviction that, for instance, the death of a relative is something awful and we must mourn for days, cry, and tear one's hair. But sometimes it's just the vividness of an unexpected impression that causes the emotion. His suggestion, then, is very like one that was made in the later Hellenistic period by the possibly heterodox Stoic philosopher Posidonius of Rhodes. For Posidonius, too, points out that in Stoic theory, it's not just any belief that an evil is present that causes distress, but only a fresh belief to that effect. Galen, who is our source here, reports that for Posidonius, the inclusion of fresh, that term, undermines the definitions of emotion given by Zeno and Chrysippus, because freshness is not a feature of the content of the impression, but rather of the manner in which it strikes us. That is why mentally preparing oneself for an event can lessen its impact. Because, and I now quote directly, or rather, Galen now quotes Posidonius directly, if anything we're unprepared for or that is strange suddenly hits us, it knocks us off balance and displaces our old judgments. So as Galen understands Posidonius, freshness is an additional factor that has to emanate from a separate emotional region of the psyche, something like the thymoetic soul part in Plato's Republic or the appetitive part in Aristotle. Being in the same camp as Posidonius, the way that Galen represents Posidonius, is not a good place for an interpreter of early Stoicism to be. Galen is using Posidonius to try to refute Chrysippus in favor of an entirely different psychology. Now, I do think we might rehabilitate Posidonius to some extent and give him a position that's more supportive of the mainstream Stoic account. Maybe he is exploring what explanatory resources are available to the intellectualist rather than rejecting intellectualism outright. And it's possible that something like that is true for Gourinat as well, that he doesn't really mean to say what his remarks on freshness appear to be saying. But I have to respond to what's on the page. So let me say this as plainly as I can. There's nothing in the way that Stoic authors use the term fresh that requires us to read it as some kind of mysterious, non-discursive element in emotion. Explanations are available with textual support that would treat the word either simply as a time marker, meaning just recent. P3 is a belief about what recently became the case. Or perhaps as an indicator of saliency. We continue to experience the emotion for just so long as we foreground P3 as the main thing that determines our practical reasoning. There would be nothing wrong with saying that in the cases of Medea and Menelaus, the emotional judgments are both excessive and fresh. Excessive in that they override an opinion that they override any opinion that might contravene them, and fresh in that they stand in the foreground of those agents' minds in the way that very recent information normally does. What we can't do, if we are explicating the views of Chrysippus, is interpret the freshness element as a cause independent of belief, an extra factor that has to be added to the thoughts and judgments of the reasoning faculty. Because Chrysippus has made it very clear that he does not mean to appeal to any such causes. So I'm going to stop there and invite your questions.